and welcome. Today I'm at the studio discussing a topic that many contemporary teachers are coming to me about, and that is the difference between what really is the contemporary style reformer in comparison to the classical reformer. And I feel that showing it directly from the studio, I'll be able to give you a direct example of really the differences of the feeling that the client would get if they are working on a classical reformer in comparison to a contemporary reformer. Now there's contemporary reformers and there's other contemporary reformers, but let's just make it very clear. I'm currently here, I've got an Aragon Pilates classical reformer and a balanced body contemporary studio reformer. Now, as far as contemporary reformers, I believe that balanced body make the absolute best of contemporary reformers that can also be semi-modified to have a feel similar to a classical reformer. I'm not saying that it's going to give you the same workout, absolutely not. The classical reformer has its own functions that change the body in a different way. The contemporary reformer is more versatile for those people who are happier, for those teachers who are happier to change and modify the exercises that Joseph Pilates has created and have the client feel it in a very different way. So the most important thing to identify when we're talking about classical reformers and contemporary reformers is the spring tension. Now the spring tension is very different from a classical reformer to a contemporary reformer. And I wanted to show you how the classical springs are the same tension, they carry the same load, and there are 4 springs on a classical reformer. On a contemporary reformer, specifically the one that I'm working on here with balanced body, has 5 springs, and the spring tension on the balanced body can be modified because they are different colors, meaning they have different loads. So I'm not going to go into the exact load per color because every manufacturer has its own different coloring system. But what I am going to say, I'm going to clarify that the fact that there's 5 springs already is creating a lot more variety, and in essence is going to help the teacher identify which exercises they can increase and decrease the load, etc. Make it a little bit more accessible for their students. So the idea behind the classical reformer, Joe Pilates created the reformer. If you have any familiarity with the history of Pilates, you will know that from the original Pilates designs that Joseph Pilates has submitted for trademarks, the reformer actually had tension at the very end. It had weights at the very end of the reformer that were pulling down. So the system that Joseph Pilates had then been modified to make it the reformer that we have seen in many of his historical videos of Joseph Pilates. And I don't believe that I am one to discuss exactly what changes have been made since Joseph Pilates had his original equipment to today, but what I can clarify, and I can say it with authority, is that I have 2 different pieces of Pilates apparatus. I was taught to teach on both of them, and I've been taught by the best teachers, so I'm very happy to share with you the knowledge that I have from classical teachers, i.e. Bob Leekens, and Bob was a teacher for Romana for a very long time. And like many classical teachers, Bob was also able to teach on the classical reformer as well as the contemporary reformer. And this is the system that I learned, and I learned it in a way to be able to create the classical workout on a contemporary reformer. However, in saying that, some of you have been writing to me and have said, can we put classical springs on a contemporary reformer and have the same feel? And the clear and very straight answer is absolutely not. You can't put the classical springs from a classical reformer, place them on a contemporary reformer and think that you are really truly doing the same work as you would on a classical reformer. The reason being there are certain differences in the carriage in the way that there's a drag at the end and there's a last 2 inches of the workout where you really have to connect, really have to pull in through the core to be able to bring the carriage home. The various differences from the classical to the contemporary include not just the spring tension, that the spring tension can be modified to a lighter tension on a contemporary, but it can't be modified on a classical. The bar safety is very different. In a contemporary, the bar doesn't move. This has a stopper, it's a safety tab. This bar lifts up, and you can see that you have to have that core control to be able to push into the bar and then be able to move the carriage. The other thing is the gear. Here it just lifts. So the gear on the classical gear lifts. And then on the contemporary, there are various manufacturers, but this one in particular with balanced body, it's so set that it slides back and forth and it has many different positions for the gear. Whereas on the classical reformer, there's 3 positions for the gear. So these are just 2 of the differences. Bearing also in mind that you've got a higher reformer with the contemporary. In saying that, there are many different reformers nowadays, so you might find, and you will find actually, contemporary reformers that are going to be the same height as the classical or even lower. They are going to have their own issues, because with a lower contemporary reformer, most definitely you will not be able to do any short box work, so you won't have a box. And the ones that you see in studios today, they are all differently made. So what I'm trying to say here is that we're trying to stay as close as we can to the classical order, to the classical work. So obviously, if you start to change the specifications of the reformer so much, then the work is not going to be felt the same. Then the last big thing are the risers. And as you can see at the end, the risers, there are risers that you can bring the riser up and down. So for the risers can be brought up or down in a contemporary reformer. This means that the exercises done with the risers up are going to be able to facilitate it better for the client, whereas on the classical reformer, there's only one setting for the strap, which is the leather strap, and because it's on a low setting, because of physics, then the angle that is going to make it harder for the client to work from. So that's why many people choose not to have a classical reformer in their studio. That's why many contemporary teachers shy away from working from the classical work, because there's a lot more restriction happening in the classical work. But Joe Pilates created this on purpose. He created the classical reformer because it's part of a system. And it doesn't mean that just because you are working on a reformer, you're able to do all his reformer exercises in one go. That's why we have beginner, intermediate, and advanced exercises. And that's why there are exercises that have to be learned properly on another piece of apparatus before the client is able to come and properly execute them on a reformer. Let's take the Swakate series, for example. So the Swakate series can be done on the chair, right? We know that there's the baby chair, and with the baby chair, we are able to develop the strength that is needed and that stability to then take on that strength that happens in the classical reformer. On the contemporary reformer, you don't need that, because on the contemporary reformer, it's made simpler by raising the riser and by reducing the tension. That makes it simpler. Now, it makes it simpler to access the exercise, but does that actually mean that the client can do the exercise? Are they ready for the exercise? In the classical work, no, the client isn't ready for the exercise. They haven't developed the back strength, the core stability, and the mobility in their back to be able to create that movement, to perform, if that is the word we want to use. So what would we do in the classical work? We would then take the client to another piece of apparatus, like the armchair, to develop the back strength, to then be able to sustain that stability while the client is performing the Swakati series. The Swakati series is a very difficult series to do in a classical reformer, and that's why it is said that Joseph Pilates created that series of exercises for women on the armchair. Never wanted them to go on the actual reformer. So that's giving you an idea of how the classical system works. Not all the exercises are accessible to everybody at the same time. So you can't expect, just because you have seen an exercise on social media and maybe as a teacher you haven't actually practiced it yourself, but you know that you're able to do it because you can start modifying the apparatus you're working with, then that's not really teaching the essence of Pilates. Pilates is there as a system to be built over time. It takes patience, perseverance, and persistence, as Joseph Pilates said. So it's not something that's going to be accessible to you or the client straight away. Work the system. Be very informed about why everything is linked together. Be very informed on what modifications you can do to be able to strengthen the body a little bit deeper on another piece of apparatus before you start working on the reformers. And this really brings me to say, there's so many intricacies in the reformers that are so different from a classical reformer to a contemporary reformer. I haven't even managed to talk about the carriage, the drag on the carriage. So many different things that are going to make that work deeper. And I see that very much with the people that I work with. So if you are in doubt on what kind of certification you're going to take, you should really do your homework, do your research, and find out from the school you're applying to what kind of work they're teaching, and really identify the knowledge of your teacher trainers. Ask them, what experience do you have? Who have you trained with? What lineage have you worked through? This is important for you to identify where you are going to be standing as a Pilates teacher. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions about this or anything to do with either the apparatus or the teacher training programs, I am here to support you. Reach out to me. I offer free discovery calls so we can discuss your personal needs. And if you like the video, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and of course, ring the bell so you get notified every time I upload a video online. Until my next video, goodbye for now.